everybody, DeathsStalker here. So I've been watching a few moto vloggers who've been doing a moto vlogger challenge about what is the best era for motorcycling. Now, you know, of course, some people might think it's the 50s, the 60s, 70s, you know, whatever. And my opinion is going to be the 1980s. And not necessarily because the bikes were the best. Now, when I started riding in the early 80s, the motorcycling was starting to change. In the 70s, you talk to anybody who rode any sort of a British bike or a Harley, and several even Japanese motorcycles, they were not reliable. The Japanese, of course, were the best of the bunch. The British bikes, Italian bikes, and the Harleys were terrible for reliability. You constantly were having to work on them. So the people who tended to get into motorcycles were like super passionate about them and super passionate about working on them, which is not good for the general population. Now, when I came in, the electronic ignition that, you know, we all take for granted now was pretty much standard across the board. Pretty much everyone was using it, which made motorcycling more available to the general population. And like, I know, like when I started riding in the 80s, there was a massive boom. Like the number of sales of motorcycles, you know, compared to the 70s, had just gone right through the roof. Way more people riding all kinds of motorcycles. The manufacturers are making like just a ridiculous amount of makes and models. Like if you look in the early 80s, you know, Yamaha, Honda, Kawasaki, and to a lesser part Suzuki made a motorcycle for every possible interest in motorcycling, like a cruiser, customs, a standard bike, a sport bike, you know, a full deck touring bike, and that was just going on everywhere. Now, the other thing about this at this time was motorcycles were not that expensive. Well, Tesla, like people, like to give you an idea, like my first bike, the '83 Interceptor, I believe it cost me $3,400, which, you know, in the 1980s was still not cheap, but not super expensive. But when you look today at the, you know, the equivalent motorcycle today, you know, which would be like the, you know, the 600cc bikes today, like those bikes would be the equivalent, and they're like $10,000–$12,000. And, you know, $12,000 is a lot of money for something you're only going to ride about 4.5–5 months a year. So motorcycling back in the 80s, you know, was a pastime. It was like, you know, when you got your boat or your snow machine if you lived in Canada. You know, a motorcycle was something that it was a hobby and you could enjoy it and you could justify it. Now, today, it is very expensive, like insurance and everything, so that it becomes, you know, the people who are really passionate about it will get it, but not the general population. And you can see that by the number of sales. Like, you know, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, except for, you know, places like the Far East. Most people who are into motorcycles have a disposable income to do it, like, because the difference between buying a motorcycle and buying a used car, the used car wins now. So that to me is one of the reasons why I think the 80s wins. Like, motorcycling was starting to get expensive into the 90s, and of course it still gets expensive. Like this RC51, when it was made in 2004, was $15,900. Now that was an exotic at the time, you know. So that was, but you think about it, in 2004, and the bikes like this nowadays from Ducati and like the Honda RC213 is like $218,000. You know, so like prices have really gone up. Like the technology's there's no question about it. Like they're super exotic, super fast, and they're actually very reliable to a point, but they're just not available for the general population. So it just makes them, you know, it's actually hurting our sport by not having inexpensive, cool bikes. Now, and the manufacturers are trying to do that, make them the starter bikes, you know, a lower price point, and you know, they're making them stylish, you know, more like the big bikes now. I remember seeing the I think it was the RG 125, or sorry, the GSX-R 125. What it was, it looks just like a GSX-R 1000, just on a scale down. Oh, that's right, I keep forgetting with the access closed. This is a bad way to come this way. Oh well, you learn. Now the other thing that's interesting about the bikes in the 80s is that you saw the manufacturers taking chances. You know, Suzuki, of course, they built their the first GSX-R 750 and GSX-R 1000 and whatnot. You know, with the like especially you could buy an actual race bike from Suzuki with a dry racing clutch and everything. And then a couple years later, Honda came out with the RC30, and that just never happened. So that was the beginning of, you know, things really changing in the motorcycle industry. You know, the Kawasaki, you know, originally came out with what we call the GPZs, which was their sport bike line, which morphed into the Ninjas that we know of today, and makes things kind of interesting. Yamaha, we had the FZ750, which eventually morphed into a couple different bikes to become the R6s and R1s. I can remember when the Honda Hurricane came out, which was a, you know, revolutionary motorcycle, 600cc and 1000cc, and those later on went on to become what was the CBRs, which pretty much everyone knows now. So there's a lot of things that happened in the 80s and 90s which made motorcycling pretty interesting. But it took the chances of the 80s, where we had a large group of people who became motorcyclists, and a large amount of them are actually still doing it. It's kind of weird. You go to a motorcycle show and you see all these people hanging out on various bikes, and they're all my age or older. You know, we still see the young people out there, but unfortunately, you know, we are the majority of being the old people, and the industry's got to change, or there's going to be even less and less. So anyways, that's my that used to be a car wash, now is some sort of a medical office. Well, anyways, so that's my take on what I think the best motorcycling era was. Probably the single bike I would pick is the RC30. I think everyone pretty much agrees that it's absolutely gorgeous. When I was racing, they had one in the shop was being turned into a super bike, and I just kept looking at it. Like, I'm a Grand Prix bike guy, but it was gorgeous. Like, you just sat there and look at the clockwork, you know, gear-driven cams and all that stuff. It was just beautiful. So if you agree or disagree, put your comments in there. I enjoy to hear them. DeathsStalker signing off.